Want to welcome you to our webinar today. Lots of information to share, and we've been really pleased with the registration so far. About 106, as I understand, from our Zoom account. So really pleased to have everybody with us. Today is it's an open forum. We've got a bunch of different stakeholders from across the country joining us, ranchers, farmers, Alberta Environment Parks, Environment Climate Change Canada. Got some folks from Ag Canada with us. See Bill Dorgan right at the top of my screen here. So it's good to see you, Bill. It's been a while. So lots of folks from industry. So obviously there's a lot of interest in this topic, and there's a lot of activity on the landscape, and so farmers and ranchers are really wondering what the carbon market means for materializing monetary value back to the farm. And so again, lots of things in the hopper developing around that. So maybe John, if you're controlling the slides, maybe we can just go to the first one. So welcome. If you've got questions, okay, Bill's got echoes. Kaylee, is that from me, or is there somebody that maybe doesn't have their microphone muted?
That might be a microphone issue. Bill, if you have a speaker or headset in, as well as your audio, as well as the speaker set playing, that might be why you're hearing an echo, but I'll shoot you a message here. Perfect.
Thanks, Kaylee. So yeah, any questions that you have, if you'd like, you can pop them into the chat as we go. We will be hosting a Q&A session at the end of our presentation, and lots of project partners on that can tackle specific questions. But if you'd like to have something answered as we go, pop it in the chat, and if we can do it through the chat function, we'll do so. If we need to leave it to the end, we can do that as well. So purpose of the webinar, what are we here for today? We want to discuss, in broad terms, what are grassland carbon offsets, and certainly to my comments earlier, what does that mean to me as a rancher? So, my farm here in New Brunswick, just down the way, much different from a rancher down in Okotoks or in the foothills of Alberta, or nestled in the heart of Saskatchewan. So what does that mean for each one of us as we move across the country, and what are the unique opportunities that exist for each one of us, regardless of farm size and makeup? What is this group doing to facilitate and grow the carbon grassland opportunity, and how can I help? So as a stakeholder, as a government official, as an NGO, as a farmer, what are the opportunities for you specifically to get involved in this project and or support our efforts long term? Next slide, John. So what is the pilot project? We'll go to the next one. So a lot of you will recall that over the last, oh my goodness, what are going on, 5 years, Canadian Forage and Grassland Association has been actively involved in developing what is now the Canada Grassland Protocol, which the pilot is all about today. And you see the pilot project partners on the screen. The protocol, as you'll recall, original intent set out to build a practice-based protocol that could say practice X gives carbon sequestration Y. So me as an operator, I'm putting in, increased legume content in my pastures here in Brunswick. That gives me X, or Y carbon per acre multiplied by the acres. You get the picture. What we found is that the data did not allow us to pinpoint specifically what kind of sequestration rates we were getting by BMP. So took the aggregate model and looked towards an avoided conversion protocol, which will be discussed later. We picked up a ball that was left on the fields in some work in Ontario and carried that across the finish line. This pilot project is phase 2 of that effort. we'll hear from Betty from CAR just a little bit later on what they do and how the protocol fits in. But all these project partners before you here are essentially the team that's bringing us out onto the landscape to understand, the good, the bad, the opportunities, the challenges, things that need to be modified, and tips and tricks that we can build along the way to make it as applicable as possible across the country. So really, hats off to all the folks on the screen here. Certainly a very key partner in getting the protocol built for us and delivering on the pilot project. And John has just done a fantastic job of coordinating this thing. Denise is with us from Shell Canada, providing some financial support and moral support and demand side in the market to carry us forward. See lots of conservation groups there and land trusts, absolutely critical to support permanence. Radicle, Brightspot down at the bottom now, validation, verification, moving through the carbon offset value chain. Climate Action Reserve, who hosts this voluntary protocol, and then Regrow, who's helping us to look at the opportunities for satellite imagery in monitoring these projects. So thanks so much to all the partners. It really has been fantastic building this working relationship. John, go ahead. So what are the goals of the project? Again, we've got the Canada Grasslands protocol on the ground. It's been approved. It's the first protocol to be approved through CAR Canada and Grasslands and avoided conversion. So a lot of firsts that go along with that. But we need to understand, how it works in practical terms, and that's why the project partners are so critical in helping us to test that with landowners. And based on the feedback we get, we have the opportunity to modify. So it is an iterative process, right? As we find things that don't quite work, don't fit, or too expensive, whatever the challenge is, we've got the latitude and the opportunity to change it. So that's why we're running the pilot. Again, to goal number 2 there, testing the commercial and contractual terms, right? So we're moving this through. Really important to have all those agreements in place. A paper trail is absolutely critical to the demand side of the market as they move that over, towards their compliance measures. So we needed to understand all of those paperwork, that entire paperwork trail, and the documents and processes that need to be included in that to make sure that we're maximizing our efficiency. And that's, looking at the Regrow's component of this, looking at using remote sensing, satellite imagery to help us to validate acres, covers, management, rangeland health. You'll hear all about these in a little bit, just a little bit later, but really trying to streamline the process and understand how we can maximize the dollars going back into the farmer or rancher's genes. Fourth one is to demonstrate the feasibility of the protocol for the compliance market. And that really is the end game for this, ideally, is moving from the regulated market where it resides currently and into from the voluntary market and into the regulated market, which is where we start to see the value of the carbon ratchet up fairly significantly and rapidly. So 2 options there. Obviously, we're looking at the Alberta Environment Parks. We've got some folks with us from Alberta. Glad to have you, and also promoting this for inclusion in Canada's offset system, so that we can grab those again, get into those 2 regulated markets. So objectives, reducing the risks, right? As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of action in this space, a lot of actions, particularly in the voluntary market. And there's numerous ideas on how to get this done, numerous ideas on how to limit the paperwork burden. And we get that, and we agree with that, right? But we need to have, some consistent platforms to support farmers and ranchers to reduce their risk of entering the carbon market. group learning, absolutely critical, and it's been really refreshing again to be part of the conversations with all the project partners that, you know, in some cases would be competitors, but the goal, you know, where everybody's keeping their eye on the prize here, and so that group learning has been really refreshing and exciting, actually, for me, to watch these partnerships as they've grown. And you know, this meeting today with 106 people is you know, also exciting as we welcome potential new partners. Efficiencies, we've said that all the way along. We've got to break down the red tape however possible, and get into automatic type of data collections, and remote sensing is one of those. To raise the profile with growers, and we've heard this through, you know, provincial cattle associations have reached out to say, look, we're getting a lot of questions about this carbon thing, and guys and gals are wondering how to take advantage, you know, to put those dollars in the jeans, but they don't just know where to start, right? Or who to believe in some cases, where to go for the information. So we're trying to build that repository, and we've got a communications toolbox that we're currently working on that we've talked about with some of the provincial beef associations that will help to, you know, streamline those messaging and get us to a baseline position. Increase the confidence in those compliant markets to approve the protocol, right, up into those regulatory markets. And I guess that's the beauty where we are now in this pilot. You know, we're walking through all the steps. We're finding the deficiencies. We're making some missteps along the way. And so this is a safe place to do that as part of a pilot project. And so as we go through again and make those improvements based on the challenges that are faced, right, hopefully, you know, that is the intent, is to raise the confidence in what we've got here to take it forward. Building that framework to take projects forward into the future. You know, we've got some private industry stakeholders here. We know that there is intent to build some carbon offset projects into the future, and that's fantastic. And that's exactly what we're looking for here, is to bring folks in and help them to develop those ideas as we go forward. There's a lot of grasslands out there. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on the carbon offset side. It certainly is an all hands on deck situation. So this is where we're trying to facilitate players to get into the market and do the job, so we can, again, maximize the dollars and jeans for the growers. So I think, John, I've probably gotten through. The last one there is building confidence and momentum, which goes to my last comment. So I think I'm so.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Cedric. So I think, you know, there's a real mix of people on the call here. There's people that are experts in carbon markets. There's people who are probably confused about what a carbon market is, what a carbon offset is. Cedric referred to all those things in the introduction. So we just wanted to spend 5 minutes going through a really kind of carbon markets 101, just to bring everybody up to speed. And obviously, if there's questions about this, throw them in the chat, and we should be able to answer those as we go through the presentation. But just to kick us off, so what are offsets and what are carbon markets? So really, if you think of a carbon offset as a tradable unit or a commodity, that's a really great way to think of what a carbon offset is. And really, a carbon offset is just 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the standard for how we measure greenhouse gas emissions. And it's 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is either reduced or sequestered, so stored in some way, maybe in soils of grasslands, for example. And so the way that carbon offsets are produced is through protocols. And so, you know, today we're talking about the Canada Grasslands protocol. Effectively, this is just a blueprint that sets out the rules for how a carbon offset is developed. And those protocols are validated and approved by a market regulator. So these are the regulators that control the market. They basically approve, you know, the blueprints or the models for how carbon offsets are developed within their own market. The market regulator sets the standards specific to that carbon market, At a high level, most carbon markets adhere to the same ISO standards, but in those standards, there's some gray areas and there's different ways of interpreting within those standards. And so that's how some markets differ from one to another. So just to sort of give you the lay of the land in this context that we're talking about today, like I said, we have the Canada Grasslands Project Protocol. That's the protocol that's approved by the Climate Action Reserve, who's the market regulator, for use in the voluntary market for Canada. And I'll talk about what a voluntary market is in a second. But suffice to say, the voluntary market for Canada is the market. And like I said, the Climate Action Reserve is the market regulator. So hopefully that kind of puts it into perspective a little bit, who each player is and how these things work a little bit. Just to take you through, how carbon offsets markets work kind of step by step at a very high level. You start off with, an emission reduction. So in this context, we're avoiding greenhouse gas emissions through avoiding the conversion of grasslands that are at risk of being converted. And so I'll get into exactly what that means in my next segment. But really, you start off with an emission reduction. At the same time, there is a buyer somewhere out there. And so this buyer is looking for carbon offsets on the market. They might be looking for carbon offsets on a compliance market or a regulated market. That's the same thing. That's, in regulated markets or compliance markets, buyers are looking to purchase offsets to meet a regulation. So in Alberta is a great example. We have a regulation for emitters to offset their emissions to a certain level. And the one way that they can do that is by purchasing carbon offsets on Alberta's carbon offset market. That would be a regulated or a compliance market setup. There are also voluntary markets, which is where this protocol exists at the moment. And voluntary markets really are exactly that. They are where buyers can voluntarily purchase offsets to meet voluntary targets, greenhouse gas emissions targets. So you'll see loads of companies right now setting greenhouse gas targets in the media, and a lot of those companies will be looking for offsets on voluntary carbon markets to meet those voluntary targets. So those are kind of the two starting places at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Like I said, the emission reduction has to be quantified and it has to follow this approved protocol. And so often those protocols are, fairly specialist and, need some specialist input to develop projects underneath those protocols. And so this is where a project developer might come in handy, not necessarily needed, but basically the next stage is to develop the project according to the rules of the protocol and according to the standards of the particular market. Once all those rules are met and everything's been verified and everybody's happy that an emission reduction really has occurred, the market will then issue a carbon credit for that emission reduction. And so those carbon credits will be issued and listed on the market registry and owned likely by the project developer or the project owner on the registry. At the same time, once those offsets are listed on the registry, a buyer can come in and make a payment for that offset that's listed on the registry. Obviously, there's a transaction that takes place there where the carbon offset, like any other commodity, the carbon offset is exchanged for some sort of financial, or it could be any kind of transaction really, but there's an exchange there, a transaction where the carbon offset is transferred to the buyer, and obviously the cash or whatever the investment is transferred back to the owner, the project owner up here. And so eventually, once the buyer has the credits and wants to retire them to meet their targets, that's when they retire those credits and meet those targets. So hopefully at a high level that gives you an idea of how carbon markets function. If there's any questions, put them in the chat. I'll try to answer them as Denise goes through her buyer side perspectives on carbon offsets and carbon markets. I'll hand over to you, Denise.
Thanks, John. So thank you for being here today. Appreciate your time. And for those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Denise Chang-Yen. I'm the manager for our NatureBased Solutions business, which is based in Calgary. Just to provide some context for NatureBased Solutions, when I talk about that, for us as Shell, that means investments in projects that either conserve, protect, improve management, or restore natural ecosystems, whether that's grasslands, forests, wetlands, peatlands, and so on. So the carbon aspect is the defining feature of our NatureBased Solutions business. And so I just wanted to start with a little bit of context around why is Shell investing in these types of projects. So John, could you move to the next slide? Before I go into all of that, I just wanted to make you aware that because I will be talking about some forward-looking things in Shell strategy, I need to share this cautionary note from our legal team. Next slide, please, John. Shell's Powering Progress strategy is very much aligned with the Paris Agreement target. And so, as John mentioned, there are a number of organizations, corporate organizations, who are committing to net zero by 2050. This is aligned with the Paris Agreement and trying to get to that 1.5 degree world in which we need to address climate change in a very big and bold way. So we have committed to trying to get to net zero by 2050, and we have interim targets along the way. And when you look at the mix of where our carbon footprint is created, there is a small portion that comes from our actual operations at Shell, but then there is a larger portion that comes from the fuels that we sell to our customers and the carbon footprint that is created when, say, customers use that for aviation, or when they drive cars or ships and so on, right? So when we made our commitment, we wanted to reduce to net zero for the entire value chain, or the entire footprint from creation all the way to when the end user uses the fuel. So that's why you've seen a shift in Shell's portfolio towards lower carbon forms of energy. So not only are we reducing at the source of our current emissions at our existing operations, but we're starting to invest in things like renewable energy, energy storage, electric vehicle charging, biofuels, and a variety of things that will help us to reduce our carbon footprint of the fuels that we sell to our customers. Obviously, this isn't just for ourselves, but also for our customers, because they are looking for ways to reduce their carbon footprint. But there are some things that are just going to be really hard to get to net zero in a very short time frame. Or even today, we will struggle with how do you get to a reduction in our carbon footprint without using carbon offsets. So carbon offsets are one way of us being able to contribute to this goal, particularly in the short term, but also because nature has the capacity to help meet these goals in a significant way, while also providing some other additional benefits in terms of biodiversity, other environmental benefits, as well as helping to sustain some of the ecosystems that we all value and provide community benefits. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. So for the last 3 and a bit years, I've been in this role at Shell and looking at investments in Canada. And the interesting thing about Canada is we think that there's a significant potential for nature-based solutions projects in this country. However, we're struggling with the frameworks to make that investment happen. So you probably know that there's a compliance system in Alberta, and there's a federal system underway. but there aren't very many protocols that you can actually use to develop projects in Canada. So we were really interested in helping to unlock that potential. That's why we're participating in this project, is not just as a funder, but also because we are aligned with those same goals that Cedric mentioned earlier about trying to unlock the value in these natural ecosystem opportunities. So we wanted to help not just from the funding and buying the offsets perspective, but seeing if we couldn't help with protocol development. So we participated in the working group to help get the CAR protocol released, but also we wanted to test it out to see, you know, how does this work in practice? What might we need to do to make this more efficient? And particularly for the landowners, because if this isn't attractive for landowners, then it's not really going to be successful. So we wanted to learn with everybody else participating in the pilot project. So we've been on board since the beginning, trying to help unlock the opportunity where we can to help with, you know, whatever along the way. We've got a team of folks on the technical side who can help. We've got others who are keenly interested in understanding the commercial arrangements and so on. But really, again, we want to really understand, what does this mean for landowners and what do they need in order to make this successful for them? Next slide, please, John. Thanks. And the other thing that's really important for Shell and possibly for a number of buyers in the market is quality credits. And I cannot stress this enough. We hear many claims in the market about, you know, these are real carbon reductions. We've quantified them ourselves, and we think these are really good for XYZ reasons. For Shell, this is not sufficient. We look to third-party registries, credible third-party registries, and many of them international registries like the Climate Action Reserve, provide a degree of scrutiny in terms of how the credits are quantified, that it's gone through like scientific review, not just by those who develop the protocol, but usually there is a third-party public comment period that allows others to point out how we might be able to improve on what we've been thinking in terms of the quantification. And that also provides some degree of confidence, not just in the carbon quantification, but that it has gone through this verification process and that there has been some thought about the other environmental impacts that you can have with these projects. So we expect that there could be positive biodiversity impacts of these projects, that there should be positive community impacts. And so this isn't just about the carbon, it's about ensuring that we have a quality project from a variety of perspectives. So the Climate Action Reserve and that sort of system allows us to have confidence in the projects in which we invest. In addition to that, we do our own due diligence at Shell. We have our own framework for ensuring that the credits that we invest in are of good quality, because we do not want ourselves or our partners in these projects to ever be called into question that, you know, this wasn't actually something that was a credible project, either from an environmental or a social perspective. And I can't stress this enough. Quality as a buyer is more important than just about anything else, just in terms of making sure that we have something that is something we can have confidence in, because in the end, these carbon offsets, and particularly those from avoided conversion projects, they're a trust-based instrument. And if we can't have trust in the credibility of the project or the system in which the project is registered, then we would have great challenge with being able to work with this instrument with our customers, because we are using these credits to help our customers decarbonize as well. So we do need to have credits from nature-based projects that are providing the benefits that we promise. So maybe I'll just leave it there, and I'll put in the chat maybe a link to some of our recent reports on nature-based credits and this particular report on quality.
Awesome, thanks, Denise. So now over to Betty on why do pilots matter for carbon offsets?
Yes, thank you, John. Can you please move on to the next slide? Hi, everyone. My name is Betty Savaris. I am an Associate Director of Policy at the Climate Action Reserve. And I'll be talking today about our role in this pilot project, a bit more info about what a protocol is, although John will give you more details about this particular protocol, the process we follow to develop protocols, and why pilot processes are key for the continuous improvement of the carbon market and protocols, and again, our role in this whole project. So in general terms, offset protocols provide the rules for eligibility, what types of lands in this context can be submitted for a project, how these projects need to be quantified, how they need to be monitored, how data has to be collected and reported, and ultimately how the projects need to be verified. This whole protocol, the main purpose that it has is to ensure that credits have financial value and environmental integrity. As Denise was mentioning, they are meant to ensure that these emission reductions are real and that make sure that the buyers are interested in them, right? Like we're we are backing the claims that these activities are generating emission reductions. And so the Climate Action Reserve has a public process to protocol development. As in comparison to other registries, we keep protocols in-house, meaning that we drive the protocol process. We start from scoping. A scoping paper is typically a collection of all the science and knowledge on how these, why this project idea makes sense. In the case of this particular grassland protocol, we started with the experience we had in the United States for the Grasslands protocol of the US, and then we scoped how that could be adjusted to Canada, always with the support of Viresco. Then once we have a strong scoping paper that gives us that assurance that the protocol makes sense, we begin an iterative drafting process where we draft the protocol and then we bring it to a group of expert stakeholders that we put together to help us think about this idea. Stakeholders from many different perspectives are in this group, from verifiers, project developers, environmental organizations, etc. That help us make sure that it's a robust methodology. Once everybody is on board with the idea and we all feel that the draft is ready, we release it to public comment. We have a public workshop to present the idea, and then we welcome questions and comments from anyone out there that is interested in this idea. And then we address those comments, incorporate the feedback that is relevant, and then we submit this protocol to board approval. This whole process takes at a minimum 6 to 9 months and can sometimes take longer. So I think that brings a lot of transparency to the market and certainty that the credits are real. Then and then I want to talk about this particular protocol. This began when we were part of the process to develop protocols for the Ontario government in 2017. With the change of the administration, that process was truncated. But the work that had already started We were able to finish it with funding from the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association with in a partnership with Viresco Solutions, and we were able to adopt it in our program in October of 2019. Since then, the protocol has been ready to be used, and right now, as Cedric was mentioning, we're in like the second stage of funding for grasslands conservation with this pilot, and this is key in our program. Pilot processes help us improve these protocols in an iterative process. Whenever we issue a protocol, we have a 1.0 out, like the version 1.0. We think we have the best knowledge available at the moment, that what's going to work in terms of eligibility and implementation. But as these protocols are put into practice, we learn that maybe some things are too difficult to comply with, or that maybe they don't make sense practically. So we pick out those lessons to release new versions of protocols, either a 2.0 when the changes are significant and deal with eligibility, or a 1.1 when they have to do more with monitoring or verification and reporting. And the role that we have right now in this process is to support all our partners, giving them guidance on how to interpret the policy, to take those lessons. And if there's ever something that isn't clear, we release errata and clarifications, and then eventually we'll publish a 2.0 protocol with all the lessons learned through these pilots. So yeah, with that, I finish my portion, and I'll pass it back to you, John.
Thanks, Bessie. So yeah, it's worth noting that often we don't have the opportunity to pilot protocols. We kind of launched straight into trying to develop projects, and then, like Betty said, often those version ones of the protocols don't quite work out quite so well. So it's great to be able to pilot this this protocol with a bit of funding to kind of reduce that risk for the first movers, and while we try and sort of work out all the issues and the kinks and try and make this protocol more streamlined and easier to use. So Carolyn asked some great questions in the chat, and hopefully I'm going to cover them in this section. So this is going to be a background about what the protocol actually is, what does it mean for landowners and for various other stakeholders. And so I'll just launch straight into it. So worth mentioning that this is the first carbon offset opportunity for grassland managers or grassland owners in Canada. There are no other carbon offset opportunities in this sector. Cedric alluded to the difficulties with some of the data and science behind some of this. So this is our first foray into Canadian grasslands. It's also the first avoided conversion opportunity for carbon offsets in Canada. And you'll see why that's slightly different, or an important point, hopefully in a couple of slides when I get into what that means in terms of avoided conversion, how that translates into carbon offsets. And finally, it's also the first protocol under the Climate Action Reserve voluntary market for Canada. So a lot of firsts, and so this is why the pilot is so important. And so into the protocol itself, this is if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar about what the protocol is, this is it. So we're assuming that the grassland is going to be converted to an annual cropping or some other kind of system. So this is a critical point to understand. When we're developing carbon offsets, we usually look at a baseline assumption and then what actually happens on the ground. The difference between the two in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions is what the credits are generated for. So there's several implications of this. So first one is the credits are actually generated through this protocol for the avoided loss of soil carbon stocks. Less than the majority of the carbon offsets through this protocol. So if we're assuming that the grassland is converted, there's obviously a loss of soil carbon associated with that conversion. And so that's what the credits are being generated for in this protocol. Carolyn, I think this is one of your questions. The credits are not generated for additional carbon sequestration. As Cedric alluded to, we just don't have the science yet to be able to develop a protocol for that. So we took the lowest common denominator for this protocol and really kind of said, okay, what can we actually develop carbon offsets for? It's really for maintenance of existing soil carbon stocks that are at risk of being lost. And so that assessment of the risk of conversion is absolutely fundamental to this protocol. There's a fundamental rule in carbon offset markets that offsets can only be generated for activities that are additional to what would have happened to a business as usual or baseline case. And so we need to prove that these grasslands are actually at risk of being converted and that those emissions are actually at risk of occurring. And I'll get into how we do that in a slide or two. Conversely, the project itself is the act of conserving that grassland and preventing that conversion. And in this protocol, we do that via a QLCA, which stands for a Qualified Land Conservation Agreement. In our practice, in practice in this first pilot that we're doing, that translates to a conservation easement or an easement that's placed on the land. But that QLCA term is intentionally generic because we want to see if there's other options, other instruments that we can use to provide that guarantee that grassland won't be converted. And so I like to put this into a graphical form, just to show what the credits actually are from this protocol. So if you look at this graph, along the x-axis, along the bottom is time in years. We're assuming here that the conversion of the grassland happens at year 0. And the y-axis up the side there is rate of soil organic carbon loss per year, per hectare per year. And so the blue line is basically a model that shows the modeled rate of soil organic carbon loss year over year. And the red line is what the credits, how we generate the credits in the protocol. And you can see that stepwise function just tries to mirror that blue line. But the takeaway really is that we're developing offsets through this protocol for that avoided loss of soil organic carbon, basically the area underneath the curve. And Carolyn, you also asked about permanence. There's a slide about permanence, but really there's two options really for generating credits through this protocol, and they're based on different accounting schemes and how permanent those soil carbon stocks are. And I'll get into that. I assume there'll be questions on this, but the first one is if you have a long, effectively a perpetual or 130 plus year term of the easement or of the QLCA, then you generate credits according to this graph on the right hand side. You get the full amount of credits for the 30 years that they can be generated for. Another option that we generated in the first year of the pilot was a different accounting scheme that allows for shorter permanence terms. So that, in our experience, translates to shorter easement terms. At a minimum of 20 years is what the Climate Action Reserve has allowed. And really that allows shorter permanence terms, but you get a correspondingly lower amount of credits that you can generate because the permanence term is lower, and I'll explain that on the next slide. But just to say that we have generated that second option. Right now it's a hypothetical option, but it is an option, and we'd like to explore it a little bit more in the second year of the pilot. So just to get into what permanence is and what reversals are, and what I was talking about there on that last slide. Permanence is another fundamental rule for all carbon offset projects that are involving sequestration or storage of carbon. basically we consider the risk of that stored carbon being reversed or being emitted once the offset has been issued. The reason for this is that because a carbon offset is a commoditized unit of carbon, it's based off of an internationally recognized standard of 100 years. So effectively, the impact of that ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the course of 100 years is the international standard for carbon offsets. What this means is that we have to, for every ton of carbon dioxide that's stored in the ground, we have to show that we are generating offsets according to that 100-year standard. So we can do that either by guaranteeing the carbon is stored for 100 years from the point of the project start, or we can, like I said in option 2 on the previous slide, we can look at a different way of accounting for that, but you get a proportional, effectively a 1% of the full amount of credits per year. I can get into that it's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but we can pick that up in the Q&A afterwards if there's questions around that. But really, ways that we mitigate the risk of reversal and guarantee that 100-year storage. We can look at contractual arrangements, we can look at legal arrangements, look at financial implications or penalties potentially, or we can set aside a proportion of the credits that are actually generated as basically a bank or a reserve in case a reversal happens. So what might be a reversal? So in this protocol, we kind of divide reversals into 2 main categories. The first one is unavoidable reversals. So this is, where a natural event or something that's completely unavoidable might lead to the loss of those soil carbon stocks that we've already credited for. That could be a flooding event or a drought, potentially landslide, maybe a tornado, something that's completely unavoidable. And then, the Climate Action Reserve would look at maybe using some of those banked or reserved credits to compensate for some of those credits that effectively have been lost through this reversal and already purchased and retired potentially on the registry. The second category is avoidable reversals. So these are, you could look at them as intentional reversals. So if the grassland is tilled or if it's overgrazed, if there's construction or installation of new roads or something else that basically is an intentional action that would lead to the loss of those soil carbon stocks. The Climate Action Reserve looks at each reversal case on a case-by-case basis. And so, but obviously there's risks there in terms of if a reversal happens, it has to be compensated. Getting to the what Denise was saying about the quality of offsets and guaranteeing that customers are actually achieving real emission reductions through the purchase of these offsets. This is why this is such an important piece in any protocol. So moving on to which properties qualify and how. This is, again, really based on that risk assessment of risk, like I mentioned a few slides ago. So really, we want to, like I said, because this is an avoided conversion, we want to make sure that grassland is actually at risk of conversion. We don't want to be developing offsets for grasslands that are, protected potentially by legal restrictions or just are not at risk of being converted practically. And so we do that through several ways. We first obviously make sure that it is a grassland. Seems simple on the face of it, but actually when you dig into it, there's different types of grasslands. In this protocol, the way that we've developed it is that we can include native and tame grasslands under that grassland definition. Basically, based on the science that's underlying the protocol, we're able to do that. Those grasslands can have up to 10% tree cover. We can't include open water, but we can include class 1 to 3 mineral wetlands, because they're included in the grassland landscape. We thought that was a good idea to be able to include those, because likely if a grassland is at risk of being converted, so are those wetlands, those smaller wetlands. We have to look, like I said, that if the business as usual case, or the baseline situation would potentially lead to that conversion. This is a concept of called additionality, and we look at 3 different tests for that. So we look at whether there's any legal restrictions to converting the grassland. Right now, this protocol applies only to privately owned lands. For that reason, we don't want to be including, crown land that has restrictions on it being converted, or parks or that kind of thing. We also look at land suitability. So is the grassland, if it was to be converted, is it actually capable of producing crops, annual crops? We look at that through the lens of land suitability ratings. And we've done a bunch of work in this first year of the pilot about how do we actually look at those data sets and map out these projects and look at those different thresholds. So right now we're looking at class 1 to 4 as being suitable for cropping, and then there's thresholds for higher classes as well, which we can get into if there's questions about that. And then finally, we look at if there's a financial pressure to convert that grassland to cropland, and that's a concept or a piece called the cropland premium that we've also spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out exactly how do we implement that on the ground in this first year of the pilot. And then we look at if there's any other barriers that are obvious. So one barrier that we did identify in this first year of the pilot is slope. Obviously, very steep slopes are less at risk of being cultivated. And so we developed a method to cut out slopes that we don't believe are at risk of cultivation. So that's how we assess basically eligibility, like is your land at risk of being converted? On the flip side, we actually then want to go ahead and say, okay, we want to guarantee that this land is not going to be converted. And back to the qualified land conservation agreement, that's the main mechanism by which we say that the grassland is not going to be converted, and that's how we guarantee that it's not going to be converted. The main pieces in that qualified land conservation agreement need to be no break, potentially no drain of wetlands too, and then we are allowing moderate grazing or haying. Those are essential to the maintenance of grasslands and functioning of grasslands. So we are allowing that, but it's intentionally vague, and there's a reason for that. What moderate grazing or moderate haying means, and basically we assess or make sure that basically there's no overgrazing or overhaying allowed through periodic ecosystem health assessment. We also monitor annually just to make sure that the grassland is still grassland, it hasn't been converted. And then finally, there's a third-party verification of all the information in the project, just to make sure that these offsets are real and people aren't trying to play the game or trying to get credits for something that isn't viable. So in terms of how a grassland carbon project developed, this next section is basically what we've spent a whole year doing. It doesn't look like a lot, but believe me, it's been a lot of work, and it's been really great to work with all the stakeholders on this in this pilot to work through all of this practical, how do we actually develop these projects? So we came up with kind of a 4-step process and organized different activities that happen under each step. There's a bit of trial and error in figuring out how do we actually do this, but this is our sort of suggested process, and we've recorded all this in a project developer handbook, which will be I think published at the end of this pilot to help others to develop projects on the ground. So the first The first step will be screening. So basically, all those eligibility criteria that I went through on the previous slide, we'll look at make sure that the grassland is at risk of being converted. It meets the definition of grassland. And also we want to make sure that the landowner is actually interested in signing a QLCA. So an easement at this point, or there might be other instruments out there, but really, the landowner has to be interested in signing that guarantee that the grassland won't be converted. The second stage is scoping. And so this is a bit more project specific, looking at defining the project area, cutting out those trees, those open water, looking at the land suitability. We also start to look at the financial additionality in this piece. So this is that piece around, is there a financial pressure to convert? And that really means looking at the value of that piece of grassland as grassland, and what is its value, or what could its value be as cropland? And then we compare those two values and make sure that there is a financial pressure to convert. Again, we can get into the details of that if there are questions. And then we look at the grass tool. So this is another tool that's been developed as part of this pilot, basically an Excel calculator that Climate Action Reserve have developed to help us estimate what the credits that could be generated through this project could be over the 30 years. And we also look at if there's any considerations we need to look at in terms of stacking different payments for other ecosystem goods and services. Again, that's been a fairly big piece of the first year of the pilot, but we can get into specifics around that in the questions if there are questions. And really on both these two steps, Craig will present in a few minutes about potential to create a tool to do both of these steps. But we've through working through this on a few of our projects, we've decided that we might be able to develop kind of a GIS-based tool to do a lot of this work for us and streamline these two steps a little bit more. Next two steps. So number 3 will be project development. So that's the actual execution of the QLCA, signature of contracts between landowner, project developer, Climate Action Reserve, defining plans for grazing and monitoring if grazing's being included, looking at the historical land use. This needed to prove that the grassland has been grassland for 10 years at least. That was one piece of eligibility I missed out earlier, but yeah, the grassland has to have been grassland for at least 10 years before the start of the project. At this point, the project developer might form an aggregated or cooperative project. Right now, it looks like these projects do have to be aggregated unless they're particularly large projects. What I mean by that is pulling together lots of smaller projects into one larger project, and you get efficiencies of scale by doing that. Listing the project with the registries, the Climate Action Reserve, and then performing the ecosystem health assessment as a baseline too. And then number 4 is the monitoring and verification. So this is the annual monitoring that conversion hasn't occurred. There's up to a 6-year reporting period. So basically that means you can develop offsets up to, at any point really, up to a maximum of 6 years before you have to sort of start the process again. Again, I can ask questions answer questions if there's questions on that. And then signing a project implementation agreement too. So just to give you a really quick idea of what I mean by a reporting period. So there's a few different periods in this protocol. Like I said, there's 130 years permanence period, unless you go with that option 2, which again we can ask the questions if there are some. 30 years crediting period, so that's 30 years that you receive credits for if you go for the 130-year permanence period, and then you can develop credits every year if you particularly wanted to, or up to a maximum of 6 years, and develop all those credits for the 6 years at once, and then you'd start that again. And this is just a little diagram to show you that you do the monitoring, you do the reporting, the verification, and then the issuance. So that cycle can happen on an annual basis, can happen on a 6-year basis, could happen on any kind of cadence that you and the project developer decide you want to do. Okay, over to you on the land trusts and how landowners are responding.
Awesome, thanks, John. So I'm Craig Harding. I work for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I will be talking a bit for the land trusts on a couple things. So I'm going to chat a bit about sort of why we're involved in this project and what we hope to get out of it. A little bit about sort of what we're hearing so far from folks who have participated or folks who are interested in participating and need more questions answered along the way. A little bit about sort of the restrictions and obligations that are in play sort of from the easement side and what differs between that and through the protocol itself. And then a little bit sort of just about the funding models and how we still are trying to do the work we're doing while adding carbon on top of it. And then finally, as John mentioned earlier, I've got a quick slide just on sort of a macro level screening. So it's our hope of how to sort of simplify the process a little bit so that on our end, if we are a partner involved in this, we can understand a little bit sort of how a landowner's land may fit into a protocol like this from the outset so that we can start having some of those conversations early on. Next slide, John. So why are we here? Land trusts are really interested in exploring and understanding what these new opportunities are. We see our role as being there to sort of support landowners and understanding what we can do along the way to try and facilitate this process to make it easier. We're always looking for new tools for conservation to add to our toolbox. And when we're starting to understand what a qualified land conservation agreement, as John mentioned earlier, sort of was, and that a conservation easement was one thing that could represent that, we thought that this was a pretty good fit. And we're always looking to help sort of facilitate new incentives that can come along with conservation for landowners. So we really just thought that being here from the beginning was really valuable to understand what this opportunity was for landowners so that we could try and provide that level of support to people as they try and navigate an already complex world of how to conserve private land. Again, as John mentioned, an easement is an accepted backstop, providing that permanence. So that's where we were sort of a nice fit from the perspective of CAR and Viresco and the CFGA, that it's something we already provide. And then we really need to understand how these align with the other options that are available currently to landowners. So, I mean, if anyone has talked about easements with ourselves, with NCC or other land trusts, you'll know there's a variety of options out there. And how does this one come to the table to try and sort of mesh with the other things that already exist? We're also trying to understand the timing, figure out how this fits into our current easement process, and what that would look like and when we need to start doing things. And that's a big part of the learning for us so far on this process. And then understand the revenue models that carbon can generate for landowners, and what that might look like, sort of taking some learnings and understanding how protocols similar to this work in the United States and in other parts of the world, to understand sort of where the land trusts fit in all of that and how those sort of those revenue models will actually work for a landowner. Next slide, John. So what are we hearing so far? We've got lots of stuff. There's lots of excitement from people who are interested in learning more about this. There's lots of people who are hesitant, tentative, cautious, all those things. And something we're also hearing is, people are concerned about, locking themselves into something where there may be other options available in the future. And that's sort of, we knew that going into this, and part of our role here is to try and understand these options so we can answer some of these questions and, deal with some of the issues of hesitance, but also understand and balance sort of the excitement that does exist. One of the things that we're really facing is sort of, understanding what that financial return is for a landowner. As Cedric said earlier, what that means in terms of dollars in pockets, and we want to be able to sort of help people understand what that looks like. John's got a bit of a slide later that will touch a little bit sort of on this and how that works and how things, sort of decrease over time and all the things that have to go into that. And understanding, that right now everyone sort of thinks they are sitting on a gold mine, and we need to kind of balance that excitement that's not necessarily the case, and that this is an additive piece to the conservation puzzle. And we want to really understand what that is. So the other piece, and as for those of you who are new to this, you've already had a lot of complex language thrown at you from John and others earlier. we already know that our easement process is complex enough, and how do we simplify and sort of, run these processes in parallel to make them as smooth as possible? That's sort of what we're trying to understand by being involved here. Next slide, John. So in terms of restrictions, John's already pointed this out a little bit. The big thing that a conservation easement brings to the table is that permanence and that no-till requirement, which is something that, all of the land trusts that are a part of this have as sort of part of most of their conservation easements. Outside of the easement, you're making a commitment to range health, and that's what John's referring to in terms of the sort of the environmental assessment. And then based on sort of the existing funding models and how we do, there are other restrictions that are sort of, involved in a conservation easement. And that's based on, other opportunities we have to actually sort of work on conservation. So that would be things like species at risk, maybe habitat protection, riparian areas, those kind of things. That's where we draw a lot of our funding. And those are the things that we have to consider when looking at restrictions that might be put into a conservation easement at the same time as just meeting the criteria of no-till through the protocol. Next slide. So, in terms of some of those things, we've got habitat, connectivity, species at risk, wetlands, riparian area, other sort of priorities for conservation from the federal, provincial governments, other donors that supply funding, whether that's corporations or philanthropic donation. We have to sort of look at all that criteria in terms of how we fund these projects to actually get them off the ground. And we know that right now, based on today's models, that the revenue generated from carbon isn't going to sort of drive or fund conservation on its own, and we still need to rely on these other models and other funding opportunities that exist to us. And in order to bring more credits to the market, which is what people are looking for, whether you're a landowner because you see this as an opportunity, or you're a sorry, I dropped a pen and it muted myself. A buyer and you're looking to bring more credits to the market, we're trying to understand what some of those other sort of financial mechanisms might look like to bring more credits to the project. Next slide. So the last thing I'm just going to touch on is sort of this idea of macro level screening. So John's talked a little bit about soil types and the requirements. That's one piece of the puzzle. So that's the map you see on sort of the far left-hand side. It's outlining what proportion of a project needs to be, needs to meet certain soil criteria in order to be eligible. We've got sort of a project level screening. So that's the map you can see sort of top middle, the orange and yellow. And it's just looking at how does this project fit within those soil classes. And then the picture at the bottom is sort of showing slope in the area where all of a sudden you hit a certain slope and cultivation stops occurring on a landscape. So that's a piece that, we're working with Regrow. They're one of the partners on this project to understand that a little bit more. And this is what we hope to put all this together into a package so that we can look at a project and we can start to look at sort of how do we start scoping and screening these projects from day one so that we can try and balance the excitement levels and the concern that people may have on what their project may be eligible for down the road. And that's all I've got. I'll pass it back to John.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, and so now on to Walter, who's with Radicle, who's the project developer in this pilot. Walter, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be speaking with you. My name is Walter Stewart. I work as a project analyst with Radicle, and we are working as the project developer for these Grasslands pilot projects. Many of you may be asking how the value of these offsets is determined, and I'm going to get into some of the specifics of what we look at when developing projects and how we get to that final carbon value in the hands of the project owner. Next slide. So when we talk about quantification of offsets issued, there are really two numbers that we're working with. The first is how much carbon is being stored from the given project activity. And the second is how many credits will be earned from that stored carbon. The former is determined through scientific modeling, where we look at relevant emissions factors such as regional climate, geography, and soil class to find sequestration rates and carbon storage capacity in a given area. And the latter is determined by project risk and likelihood, along with project expenses, and that's really where we come in. So next slide. So the first cut out of the pie, if you will, is a project's eligibility shown on this red line. Discounts taken out in this section will occur due to the project-specific protocol guidelines. So these are used to help us find the eligible project area, which John went over earlier. And in the case of these grasslands projects, that means we are cutting out forested areas, open water, land with a steep slope, like Craig just mentioned, as it's unsuitable for cultivation, and areas not covered by a qualified conservation agreement. Next. Second comes the discount due to project risk and likelihood. These are risks related to the project's viability and financial confidence that the project will or will not have occurred due to the additional funds provided through the opportunity to earn credits. So for example, take a piece of land in a yield-rich region where we can expect with near certainty that without the economic benefit of carbon credits and a conservation easement, the land will be converted to cropland. A project in this region would likely earn more credits than one in a region with little chance of conversion. Along with economic considerations, nature-based projects are inherently risky, and any overturn of land or similar natural disaster can result in carbon releasing from the soil and losing any environmental benefit the project may have had. This is why each project contributes a small percentage of its earned credits into a shared buffer pool with the registry, in this case, the Climate Action Reserve, and that essentially functions as insurance. If there were a natural disaster or unavoidable reversal that led to the release of these carbon stored in one project, it could draw from that buffer pool to make up for lost credits while the project area returns to its natural state. Beyond that, in this stage, we are accounting for any project emissions such as grazing or fossil fuel emissions that might reduce the total credits earned due to the activities occurring within the project area. Next slide. The last piece is where organizations like us at Radicle come into the picture. As you've seen throughout this presentation, the focus on quality and assurance of credits is a high priority for these projects. What we do is to help streamline the project development process for the landowners. We will work with landowners and project owners to collect the necessary data and evidence, along with setting up any necessary site visits to assess the conditions of the land to assure credit issuance. This involves working with organizations such as the Climate Action Reserve to work out technical details of the project, along with advocating for the evidence provided by landowners. Along with organizations like the Climate Action Reserve, we work with verification bodies that assess the quality of the data and evidence being provided in a project. And we work as sort of a middleman between the project owners and these third-party verifiers. Verification itself can be quite costly. So as new projects come in, we help to list them with the registry and then aggregate those projects from across the region into a cooperative to reduce costs across all projects, allowing us to put more money in the hands of the project owner at the end of the day. Next. After these discounts are applied throughout the project development process, we are left with that green line at the top as the amount of offsets delivered to the project owner. It's good to note that these are not proportional, really. Next slide. So next as well. So as mentioned before, the quantification of carbon values is determined through a few key steps. When a new project is being assessed for eligibility, we look at the reporting zone for a project. And these reporting zones help us to estimate the emissions factors such as regional climate, geography, and soil class, like I mentioned before. It is important to note that the project does not credit for additional soil carbon sequestration over time beyond the period of the project activity. Once we've taken all of these into consideration, and then along with the specific project emissions data provided by the project owner, we can plug our expected values into the Canada Grass tool, which is provided by the Climate Action Reserve. And this tool helps us to estimate expected credits earned over a 30-year period after the discounts talked about before, giving us a better idea of the economics early on in the project's life cycle. So as you'll see, there's quite the range for potential tons of CO2 equivalent earned per acre per year. But on average, and I want to stress that average, we're seeing about half a ton of CO2 equivalent per acre per year in these pilot projects. As I mentioned before, the work of project development is not only to collect and process the relevant project emission data, but also to organize and streamline the development process to make it cheaper and easier for everyone in the end. Next. So that means that we're involved in creation of cooperatives and help to organize the various administrative tasks involved with these projects, such as setting up site visits, like the ecosystem health assessment or the cropland appraisal. And yeah, next. Over to you, John.
Thanks, I forgot. This is my piece. Yeah, so yeah, in terms of like kind of streamlining that project development process and making that green arrow on the couple of slides ago, making that green arrow bigger for landowners. These are kind of like where we're concentrating our efforts in this pilot to streamline the project development process and grow that green arrow. So looking at the protocol rules, we're looking at the deductions that are taken, the risk, how we assess the risk and permanence, you know, the eligibility or the project area. Wetlands is one example of that. We're trying to improve the emission factors that are included in the protocol to make wetlands a little bit more acceptable as an ecosystem. And improve the credit generation rate for wetlands. Yeah, and then looking at like how do we handle the land management and the reversals. So really these are all aspects of the protocol that we've been looking at in the first year and we'll continue to look at in the second year of the pilot to see how we can grow that green arrow through redevelopment of some of those rules potentially. In terms of the project development, so we've also worked on our systems on how do we verify these projects, how do we streamline the data collection, streamline the monitoring. I know there's some questions in the chat about monitoring, who does that, who's responsible. You know, all the stakeholders on this call, including the landowners as well, have different pieces of data that can be useful. You know, there's also site visits that are probably one of the biggest costs. And so if we can get the landowners doing some of those site visits, effectively taking photographs, or if we can use remote sensing data to collect that information, or if we can combine site visits between land appraisers and rangeland health specialists, for example, those are all ways that we can cut costs in the project development. And also, like I said, sharing data between different stakeholders. There's no point collecting the same data multiple times. Land trusts have certain amounts of data as part of their easement process. Remote sensing companies have data that they can share. And so finding ways to streamline those data sharing and develop those data sharing agreements between the different stakeholders has real potential to reduce those project development costs. Walter, did you want to take the right-hand column here?
Yeah, sure thing. So when we're looking at the project development side on how we can kind of cut down on these costs, as mentioned before, aggregation can really help to bring down the individual project expenses by grouping projects together, but really the primary, also next as well. So it's all on one, there we go. Primary price driver for credits is going to be the state of its respective market. So in a compliance market, there will sometimes be a price target set by a regulatory body. And on the voluntary side, like for these projects, the price is determined by supply and demand, so prices aren't guaranteed. That being said, we're optimistic about the state of the market, given the push towards corporate net zero targets in recent years. And we've seen the overall voluntary market more than double in value in the last 18 months. We'll include some links in the chat that you can read through on your own, or we can answer questions at the end as well. Next.
Okay, so we've touched on a lot of this already, but what has the pilot achieved in its first year? I should say we're pretty close to the end here. We're running over a little bit, but we'll be wrapping up and opening for questions pretty soon. So in terms of technical achievements, again, this is just a list, but really it's been a lot of work in this first year, working out the different methods and processes for doing all of these different pieces of the protocol, trying to streamline it, trying to, you know, rethink the rules as appropriate, how do we share the data? How do we, which data sources do we want to use? Can we use public data sets? All that kind of stuff. And I guess just outstanding now is just the final few pieces of how do we collect some data on grazing, fertilizer use and fuels, or most likely, how do we kind of estimate that information so that we're not relying on the landowner to provide yet more of data work and data paperwork and data to the project developer. We've looked at costs and tried to sort of sum all the costs of doing all these different pieces and developing the project. And so we should have by the end of Q1, we should have a good idea of what it actually costs to develop these projects. As I mentioned right at the very beginning, we looked at the ton-year accounting, which is that different accounting mechanism to allow a shorter permanence period. Worth noting that that's technical only. We haven't actually been able to implement that for several different reasons, which we can get into in the questions segment. We've also looked at the contracts and agreements that are required, and different, there's different agreements, different contracts between different players. We're considering partway through looking at eco-gift, but also considering looking at potentially, a carbon-specific easement. Remember that QLCA is intentionally kind of high level or generic, and so we're kind of considering whether we might be able to make an easement specific to these projects potentially. We've submitted a letter of intent to Alberta Environment and Parks in December. The intent of that letter is to develop the protocol in Alberta's carbon offset market. Cedric will talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but the main motivation for doing that is the price that offsets are sold in compliance markets is significantly more than the current prices in voluntary markets. Okay, Walter, over to you.
Yeah, so I'll give a quick update on where we're at in the pilot project at the moment. So at the moment, we have 9 landowners listed with the Climate Action Reserve. These landowners account for a little over 6,000 acres across the Alberta region. And we're currently in the process of finalizing contracts with them and anticipating verification, or our first verification this year.
Okay, Cedric, over to you to kind of wrap up with what's next and and how others can get involved.
Perfect. Thanks, John, and all the presenters. As you can tell, there's a lot of activity in this from a lot of different angles and a lot of different players doing some pretty complex stuff. So again, hats off to everybody for keeping this square. Is there another slide here, John?
Yeah, there's just a few more.
Right. So I guess ultimately there's a few things that we're trying to move this thing through. Obviously preserving our grassland ecosystems is key. And so we see this as a potential new revenue source that can help with that preservation. And again, put those dollars in the landowners' jeans. Right now, say we're working in a voluntary market space, which means we're not getting maximum dollar for that ton of carbon. So ultimately, we need to be ideally moving towards the compliance market, which takes us to 40, 50, 60, and up to $170 per ton of carbon. So that's really the push. So like John said, we've got Alberta Environment and Parks. We've got that application in there, that request to develop, and that's being reviewed. We've been pretty constant contact with Environment Climate Change Canada and Jackie Mercer and her group there in Ottawa. You'll see there is mention of this pilot project within the National Offset System development language there on the website. So taking a look at this, but we need to move ourselves into that compliance space to up the carbon value. So anything we can do there from support politically or at the provincial level, bureaucratic level, as you look at those programs. We'd like to speak with you and seek your support on advancing this through those channels. We've been through this. There's your federal government and Alberta Environment Parks, the proof of concept. Hopefully, as we move through this, and a lot of you folks at the government level are, have either been peripherally involved or directly involved in some of this work. So you understand what this is, how this is playing out, or will play out within your provinces. So anything we can do to support that effort, to answer questions, to close gaps, we want to hear about it. There's a lot of good questions, in the chat here, and we'll address some of those as we go. Those are all, pieces towards building confidence in this protocol, moving from voluntary to compliance. We are going to be putting a bit of a push on here over the next month or so to really amp up the awareness of the need to move to compliance, and certainly linking that in with preservation of grasslands, not only on the carbon side, but the biodiversity and habitat enhancement and maintenance is critical to hit all those various EG&S values that we're so trying to protect with our grasslands. That's the big picture. So plans for 22. Get it into the Alberta offset system, and we've been at this for a while. We've made several requests year over year to have it recognized and move it through, and feels like there's some good progress there. So we'll keep pushing on that, and again, any support you can offer on that would be greatly appreciated. John, any
I can take these. Yeah, so
you go ahead on this group stuff.
Yeah, for other stuff in other plans for 2022 or goals, we want to get this first group of projects verified. We're going to do some interviews and gather feedback on how that went for landowners as well as the other stakeholders. Obviously, we'll be writing all that up and publishing those findings for anybody on this call who wants to see them. We'll also be starting a second and third group of projects. We hope to develop that screening scoping tool that Craig was mentioning. We want to really refine and get, streamline the cropland premium, which is that financial assessment and the ecosystem health assessment. Those are two kind of big money items for these projects. And so we're 90% of the way there, I think, to streamlining those assessments. We also want to look at, whether we can completely reassess how the risk of conversion is assessed in this protocol, potentially through looking at like remote sensing data and looking at conversion rates over several years. We're working on some of that thinking with the Climate Action Reserve already, and we want to continue that conversation. And obviously, we want to refine the business models between these key players. We've gone a long way to developing that, but there's still some more work to do on developing basically the framework for carrying on developing these projects beyond the scope of this pilot. Finally, how can you support? So consider whether you're interested in developing carbon projects on your grassland if you're a landowner, or contact this group if you are. Pay attention to this is really more of a warning, I suppose, but pay attention to the quality and rigor of carbon programs and prices. Like Cedric said, right, there's a lot of interest, a lot of talk in this sector. Really, this is kind of, word of warning. Listen to what Denise had said earlier, about the quality of offsets and what buyers are looking for. And then finally, like Cedric was just saying, contact your MLA, promote this opportunity as a great opportunity for Canadian grassland managers to ultimately, help grassland conservation in Canada as another tool to promote grassland conservation. Cedric, do you want to add anything on there?
You rounded it out quite nicely, John. I'm sure we're going to get a chance to discuss some of those points further in the Q&A here over the next 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll continue sharing my screen in case you want to go back over the slides. But yeah, I just want to say as well, thanks to everyone for presenting and all the questions. I'm scrolling through them in the chat box here. So if anybody has a question they want to blurt out, just unmute yourself and we can have a Q&A for the next what are we on here? The next 20 minutes or so. And obviously we can take questions by email or whatever afterwards as well.
Yeah, I think we should probably maybe try and do the raised hand deal if we can, just keep this a little bit civil. So if you've got questions, go ahead and raise your hand. We can pick you out. Otherwise, John, there were a bunch of questions over here.
Maybe if you'd ask questions in the chat and it hasn't been answered, maybe this is a good opportunity to put your hand up and ask it verbally, I think.
Just what I was going to say. So are we feeling good that we answered Carolyn Callahan's original bundle of questions?
I think Carolyn had to drop off the call.
She did, but she raised some good points. I think you had presented some via text, and so we'll see if we got a new question.
Cedric, I put in the chat a link to a memo that Alberta Environment and Parks have regarding projects on annual cropping. So there's precedent there. I'll send that to the CAR folks, Betty and Chloe as well, so they have that.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. Did we get through the overgrazing? I know there was Peg Strankman had raised some questions there, and there was a bit of chat around the overgrazing. Did we get through that enough?
I'll just mention quickly, the overgrazing is assessed through that ecosystem health assessment, which is done on the cycle of 6 years, potentially. And so it's really, the ecosystem health assessment is set up to identify if overgrazing is happening. If you fail one of those assessments, you have until the next cycle, so another 6 years, to put that right. And again, Climate Action Reserve will assess that on a case-by-case basis. So it's by no means, you're on the hook for, repaying offsets or whatever. If you fail one of those ecosystem health assessments, you just have to show that you're managing the grassland appropriately and trying to prevent that overgrazing issue.
Right. Perfect, John. That's great. So I see Tom's got a hand up. And then we're going to talk. I see Peggy had another question here. Who pays for the annual monitoring? So I think between John and Craig, we can probably answer that. But Tom, you go ahead and raise your question.
Hey, Cedric. Hey, John. Thanks for the presentations today. I'm just wondering, John, have you approached Environment Canada about your question about eco-gifts? And if so, what was the response back from that?
Great question, Tom. I'm going to hand you over to Craig because he's been heading that up a little. So.
Yeah, there's been some early back and forth, Tom, and it's something that we're still working on. So we're trying to figure out what to propose. So I don't really have much to report, but just to say that it is in progress and discussions are being thought about.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I feel like that's a bit of a non-answer, but it's what I got for you right now. We're working on it. Part of what I was trying to outline about, we want to understand how these all fit together, and that is one of the pieces that we need to understand how it all fits together.
Great point, Craig. And I mean, that's the point of the pilot project, right? To get some of these questions answered. So maybe back to you again, Craig, paying for the annual monitoring. How does that fit in?
So John, I know you're flipping through slides, but I mean, that piece is sort of one of the pieces of the puzzle. That's part of sort of the agreement between who's ever doing the project development and the project owner in terms of where that comes out. But that would be a cost that would come out off the top. So that slide that I think Walter was talking about that sort of had those little colorful lines coming off of it, it's one of those items that would basically would come out of it before anyone receives any value at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Thanks, Craig. So, and Walter, feel free to jump in too. So yeah, the monitoring costs is on this purple arrow here, which is the project development services. So yeah, I mean, technically a landowner can develop one of these projects on their own, deal directly with Climate Action Reserve, and go ahead and do this. What we found in this first year of the pilot is, there's hopefully some of the complexities come across a little bit in this webinar. And also, the in terms of the amount of credits that you can generate, if you there's efficiencies of scale by combining lots of smaller projects together and splitting these costs between projects rather than having these costs per project. So that's a roundabout way of saying probably a specialist project developer will work with the landowner and the other stakeholders to figure out who pays those monitoring costs and how they're paid. Walter, I don't know if you want to add on to that. Yeah.
So I can just speak to what we're doing with these pilot projects, which is we are paying for the upfront monitoring costs with these, and then we are being paid back on the back end with credit after credit development, essentially. So that's that purple line. We're taking a small cut for that, for those services, but no money's coming out of the land or the hands of any of the project owners. And in terms of how we're collecting that, we're working with each of these to collect the various emissions data that we talked about in that blue line, that grazing, fossil fuels, et cetera. Hope that answers the question.
All right, Quentin, I see your comments here in the chat. Show us the money. Yes, from Jerry McGuire. Absolutely. Key for us to get this into the compliance system so that we can maximize the value of those tons that you're generating on your grasslands. I had a comment or a question up here from Linda Hunt about requiring farmers to take pictures annually.
That's kind of the same question, I suppose, about we haven't really, because we haven't developed these projects for a year yet. We haven't done that annual monitoring, but the annual monitoring is really, is the grassland still grassland? It's really that simple. And so photos from farmers would be potentially a very cheap way of doing that monitoring. Another way would be looking at remote sense pictures, satellite pictures to make sure that grassland is still grassland. And so we're looking at both of those options and others for annual monitoring. But as a project cost, I think it's a pretty low cost. So it's fairly low priority compared to some of the other project development costs that we've been looking at. And again, that would be up to the project developer on exactly how they want to, share those costs or share the responsibility on that.
And John, this little device is great because it gives you a georeferenced time-stamped picture that you can have, which is very useful.
Critical stuff. Lonnie says that, are we required to hire a land appraiser?
Really great question. So again, if you're working with a project developer, then that would be the responsibility of the project developer, most likely, to hire that land appraiser. This is that question on the financial risk of cultivation or financial risk of conversion. We've gone, really kind of fairly deep into what these appraisals need to look like. How do we do the valuations? And so, yes, we've ended up as, yes, you do need to have, a certified land appraiser in good standing to do those valuations. It's just a lot easier and cheaper to do it that way, to have a land appraiser who's certified sign off on the valuation rather than having, an evaluation verified by a third party. And, there's more risk with that as well. So yes, in short, yes, but also that would be the responsibility of the project developer rather than the landowner.
Okay, that's good. Peggy asked here, pilot projects in more than one province. I think Karen did answer that. We, primarily so far it's been focused in the prairies, in the native rangelands, but we have had, as per our project agreement, we are moving across the country. So we've got some contacts in Ontario we're working with some folks in Quebec, and looking at some opportunities here in the Maritimes obviously on smaller acres. And we'll be working with BC Forage Council as well to explore opportunities in BC. So the intent is to cover the country. Bill Dorgan asks, what are the implications of increasing the quality of our pastures, i.e. interseeding legumes?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. This one always gets asked. And yeah, it's another question we've kind of wrestled with this first year. Really what it comes down to is reseeding is absolutely fine as long as we're not breaking the surface of the soil and leading to loss of those soil carbon stocks. That's the short answer. There's obviously a much longer answer to that. And I think in the second year of the pilot, we're going to tackle that question a little bit more head on potentially, in terms of, maybe we can look at reseeding as a reversal, with a small kind of deduction in credits for that type of practice. But if you can reseed without breaking ground, then that's going to be the easiest, simplest way to do this without losing any credits.
Okay, I think another important one here coming from Lance Engley. Why is the crediting period 30 years, but the permanence requirements on additionality on the additional 100 years? Having payment available for the full 130 and make it more palatable to a landowner if they don't, the next generation is also going to benefit.
I'm going to hand that one to Betty if she's still on the line.
Sure. Would you mind please repeating the question?
Yeah. Why is the crediting period 30 years, but the permanence requirements are for 100? Why not make that payment available over the 100?
Sure. So we're talking about two different time periods. The crediting period, it's the time during which you're implementing your project, the time during which you're doing that active monitoring, active reporting, active verification. And it's for the time period that we have those emission factors that represent the credits that you would be getting. The permanence period is different. So for every credit that we issue during those 30 years, each one of those credits must remain on the ground or preserved for 100 years. So if on year one you're issued one credit, that one credit is going to stay 100 years. On year two, you have another credit. Your permanence period is extended by 100 more years. So that's the difference between the two. Did I get to the, was that a, yeah. Did I get to the question?
Yeah, I wonder, Lance, if you wanted to unmute and let us know.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my question, I've talked to a few landowners. So I work for the Alberta Conservation Association. So we're a conservation group in Alberta. I have a bunch of land that we're entitled, very similar to NCC in many respects. But some of the landowners we work with some of our projects, I think obviously one of the things that concerns them, and you guys touched on it through your very, very thoughtful presentation, is the length of an easement and having to have their land kind of tied up for that period of time. And one of the things that I've heard in chatting with a few folks is that after that 30 years is over, whoever has signed this agreement is likely out of the business now, or potentially will be before the 100-year permanence period is up. And that next generation comes in, and now they walk onto the land and they see no credits. They're not getting any money for it anymore, but they're still bound by the easement. And not being able to maybe break that land up if they want to. And I know that's obviously not the goal here, But it's one of these things where if there were payments throughout the life cycle of that 100-year permanence period as well, that might be more palatable to people that look to their grandkids to say, yeah, they're going to be getting money from this too. It's not just me that's going to benefit from it. So that was sort of where I was coming from.
Yeah, so I think you're talking, Lance, about kind of extending this red line out.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, eventually this red line will get down to close to zero. So it wouldn't be worth developing credits at that point. The cost of developing the credit and doing the monitoring and all that would be more than the credit that you're getting potentially. But I think, Betty, is this a policy decision that there's a 30-year crediting period for removals projects?
I mean, Grasslands is not unique to this situation. Any credit that has to do with sequestration, there is this permanence requirement, right? The fact that for that credit that you're getting in year one, for you to receive the full value of it, you need to make sure that it remains on the ground for that period of time, for those 100 years, so that it is comparable to what whoever is buying is offsetting, right? Because, yeah, so it's just in quantification terms and in real terms to the atmosphere, it's just that's what's honest in terms of credit issuance. So I guess, yeah.
Betty,
Is there a reason
here? John, this was when we were mining the inventory for the change factors with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada contributing to the quantification aspect here. It really was a 30-year time frame, right? And as you said, you get down to the lower parts and it just didn't make sense. So we had to work with the science that we have in our inventory to develop this. The 100 years, you're right, Betty, it's a totally different policy construct globally to have that remain permanent for 100 years for fungibility and transfer of these things if we ever get to a world where, you know, they're going to be transferred between countries.
with that red line, John, that you were referring to? Can you explain to me why it drops from year to year? Is that just like the carbon there's not as much carbon after a certain period of time? Is that how that works?
Yeah, it's like any natural system. It's trying to get to equilibrium, right? So if you convert a grassland to cultivation, for example, this is where the cultivation, the conversion happens. This y-axis is the rate of soil organic carbon loss in kilograms per hectare every year. And so, in the first year, you're going to see like a high rate of soil carbon loss. The second year, you're going to see slightly lower rate. Third year, slightly lower rate. These are the modeled values from the National Inventory Report that Karen was referring to. So you can see it's just going to be a curve that eventually flattens off at the, basically it's going to reach equilibrium and the rate's going to be zero.
And they're in 10-year increments because to simplify project management and quantification, we averaged the values of the first 10 years to make all the 10 years equal, but in reality, the emissions follow the blue line, but we're just averaging them in chunks of 10 years.
Okay.
It's really just the area under the blue that you're interested in. But yeah, I think your question, Lance, is basically like, why is it not the full area under the blue curve? Why does it stop at this line?
Yeah, or maybe it's even, I don't know the economics of it yet. I have some general idea of it, but maybe it doesn't make sense to spread those payments out over a longer period at smaller amounts each year, because that could be something that would be done as well, to have have that extend out to the next generation, so to speak, so they see some benefit of having that easement on their land. But,
yes, it's a great question. The US protocol actually does go out to 50 years, doesn't it, Betty? And I think it's Yeah, so so I mean, I don't know, but I would say that potentially we could extend that.
Yeah.
possibly.
Anyways, that's just food for
Good
thought, I
question.
guess. That's just something that I've heard, is that, you know, once those 30 years are gone, the crediting period is gone, I'm going to call it the burden of the easement stays with the next generation, without, you know, much benefit that they would see in terms of the show me the money components. So,
Yeah. Thanks, Lance. Yeah, appreciate it.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our time for today. I got one last comment there, Quentin, to your Jerry McGuire comment. If you'd like to get involved, you know, drop us a line. You know, we're looking for project participants, so we can help walk our way through that. Okay, I'll grab your email right now before it goes too far. We'll send you a note. So I guess I don't see any raised hands. Additionally, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Okay, so I think we'll close it out on time. So just want to, you know, take a moment again to thank all the project partners. You let me put those up on the screen, John. I don't know if we can do that. So all the land trusts.
Oh yeah.
Radicle and Brightspot for all the work that you're doing. Certainly Shell and Denise, the leadership that you've brought to the table on this, on the demand side of this market to really create this opportunity for us to flow through. And then top of the list here with Viresco and the work that Karen and John and the Viresco team has done on this. I see Saeed has popped in here today as well. So, you know, a lot of great heavy lifting there, and especially John is kind of the lead on this project. Kept us all together. As you can tell, there's a lot of moving pieces here that all have to be integrated to keep this machine rolling down the line, and so that's what John has done for us. So hats off to him for that. So with that, I'm going to thank you for being with us today. My email was in there, executive director at canadianfga.ca. John popped his in there, John at Viresco Solutions.com. You can always catch us at the Canadian Forage and Grassland website if you want to follow up with this and those contacts don't work for you. So it's an open door policy here. We're hoping to engage as many people as possible, so don't hesitate to reach out. And yeah, I guess with that, I will bid you a good day. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for joining us today.